Lucas Carter thought he had everything under control. He had built his success from scratch and memorized the harshest rules of the business world. For him, life was all about working and winning. But one night as he left his office, he realized that reality wasn't what he had thought. An employee, a cold apartment, and two little kids who couldn't sleep from hunger. At that moment, he found himself standing in the middle of a truth he had ignored for years. And from that point on, nothing would ever be the same. Lucas Carter was never one to owe his success to luck. He was the owner of an empire he had built with his own hands, brick by brick. Sleepless nights, missed birthdays, countless moments he couldn't share with his family and friends. From the outside, people saw success as bright lights and luxurious offices, but reaching this point had come at a cost. His life was filled with sacrifices that most would never know, perhaps never even understand. It had all started in Milwaukee in a tiny office, just a few desks, creaky chairs, and endless phone calls. Over the years, Carter Freight Solutions had grown into an industry giant. It was no longer just a small local transportation company. His business now spanned international logistics networks, reaching every corner of the world. And Lucas had proven to everyone that his success was no coincidence. His principle was simple: hard work always pays off. But that night, as he reviewed the final reports in his office, something caught his eye, lingering at the edge of his vision. The digital clock had passed midnight. The office was nearly empty, and the hallway lights were shutting off one by one. The company cafeteria should have been closed long ago. Yet someone was still there. Eva Mitchell. Lucas didn't know her personally, but he knew enough. Quiet, dedicated, never drawing attention yet always present. She never hesitated to take on extra work, always supporting the team, one of those employees who worked in the background but held everything together. If there was a crisis, Lucas knew Eva would be there. But this time something was different. Through the glass doors of the cafeteria, he saw her sitting hesitantly at a table. A coffee cup sat in front of her, untouched. She looked lost in thought, trapped in deep indecision. A strange impulse stirred inside him. He never interfered in his employees' personal matters. It wasn't his style. But there was something about Eva's posture, something in her expression. Was she worried? Sad? Or was she trying to make a decision? Lucas hesitated for a moment. Then, unable to suppress his curiosity, he took a deep breath and headed toward the cafeteria. Now he had a choice to make, whether to approach her or walk away. And Lucas Carter was a man who always knew how to make a decision. Lucas didn't look away for even a second as he observed the woman from his glass-walled office. There was a nervous energy in Eva's movements. She tapped her foot lightly against the floor, glanced around as if struggling to make a decision. Her fingers clutched the strap of her bag tightly. She took a deep breath, then finally gathered her courage and walked toward the kitchen staff. Lucas couldn't hear their conversation, but he noticed the chef's initial surprise, followed by a hesitant look. Eva's words were short and rushed, as if she was saying something she didn't want to but had no choice. The chef averted his gaze, reached behind the counter, and after a few seconds, pulled out a food container. When the plastic container was placed in Eva's hands, her shoulders slumped slightly. A strange tightness formed in Lucas's throat as he watched the scene unfold. Eva quickly placed the food into her bag, lowered her head, and walked away in a hurry. There was something in her steps, a shame she was trying to conceal. Was she afraid of being seen? Or was it the discomfort of finding herself in this situation? The whole thing left an unsettling feeling in Lucas's chest. He had never been the type to interfere in his employees' personal lives. To him, life was simple: work hard, succeed. If you put in the effort, eventually you'd get what you deserve, right? But Eva asking for food in the company kitchen lingered in his mind. Even if it had only lasted a few seconds, the image was now stuck there. Was she struggling so much that she couldn't even afford a meal despite working double shifts? He shook his head slightly as if trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe it wasn't his concern. But the discomfort in his chest refused to fade. He tried to return to his reports, flipping through the pages, scanning the numbers. But the letters and graphs blurred before his eyes. No matter how hard he tried to push the thought away, his mind kept drifting back to Eva's retreating silhouette. And at that moment, Lucas Carter made a decision. When he saw Eva heading toward the parking lot, he didn't even bother grabbing the pen he had just set down. He left the building without hesitation, his steps brisk yet heavy with exhaustion. He didn't pull out his car keys. He didn't call for a driver. Instead, he picked up his pace and followed her. Eva walked toward the bus stop. Lucas hesitated. Had he ever wondered how his employees lived? How they got here every morning, how they made it home at the end of the day? Someone who had given so much to his company, why was she still relying on public transportation? When the bus approached, Eva let out a quiet sigh and stepped on. Lucas paused for a moment, but then, without overthinking it, he followed. He took a seat a few rows behind her and continued to watch. She sat by the window, resting her head against the glass. She looked exhausted. But to Lucas, this wasn't just physical exhaustion. It felt heavier, like the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. And for the first time, Lucas Carter was truly seeing one of his employees. The journey was long. As Lucas stared out the window, he watched as the city's bustling business districts, bright storefronts, and lively streets faded into the distance. At first, the glow of the city lights was dazzling, but over time they began to dim. Streetlights grew sparse, sidewalks narrowed. The sleek modern buildings were gradually replaced by old, worn-down brick structures. The signs along the road were faded, some of the shops had already closed. The people walking the streets carried exhaustion on their faces, a quiet acceptance of life's burdens reflected in their weary expressions. The bus suddenly slowed at a stop. Eva flinched slightly before pressing the button and standing up. Without thinking, Lucas decided to follow her. She walked with hurried but cautious steps, turning into a narrow street. Lucas kept his distance as he trailed behind. The atmosphere shifted. Garbage bins lined the sidewalks, graffiti covered parts of the buildings, and the damp air was heavy with the smell of mildew. Finally, Eva stopped in front of an old apartment building. Lucas took in the sight of the structure that had clearly endured years of neglect. The concrete was cracked, the metal railings rusted. The numbers above the entrance had faded, and the dim hallway lights flickered weakly. The building looked abandoned by time, forgotten. Eva pulled a set of keys from her pocket and unlocked the rusted door. Lucas instinctively turned his gaze to the window. What he saw made his chest tighten. The room was nearly empty. Bare walls. A single mattress on the floor, covered with a few worn blankets. A plastic storage crate in the corner. No couch, no table, not even a chair. A single light bulb cast a weak glow from the ceiling, its flickering shadows dancing along the walls. Then, from the edge of the mattress, two small heads peeked out. Two children. Silent, wide-eyed. Eva knelt down with a tired but gentle smile, opening the food container and handing it to them. Their faces immediately lit up. They ate hungrily, as if they had been waiting for this one warm meal all day. Lucas swallowed hard as he watched their tiny fingers reach for the food. There was nothing purer than a child's joy. But what struck him the most wasn't the children's hunger. It was the fact that Eva wasn't eating. She simply sat there watching them, taking in every bite they took as if it were the greatest reward she could receive. Lucas exhaled sharply and took a step back. He needed to leave. This wasn't his business. He was just a businessman, not a philanthropist. He didn't interfere in his employees' personal lives. There were millions of people suffering in the world, he couldn't help them all. But just as he turned to walk away, a small voice stopped him in his tracks. It was soft, fragile. "Mom? Aren't you hungry?" Lucas froze. In that moment, everything he had seen tonight made perfect sense. Eva Mitchell wasn't just an employee. She was a mother fighting to keep her children from going hungry. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Carter had no idea what he was supposed to do. "Mom, will we have breakfast tomorrow?" Lucas held his breath. That small, innocent voice cracked through even the hardest walls inside him. Eva's response was soft, but the tremble in her tone couldn't hide the helplessness beneath it. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll take care of it." It was a sentence meant to plant hope in a child's heart. Not because she truly believed it, but because they needed to. Something inside Lucas broke. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake for hours in his office, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling endlessly. He was a businessman. Solving problems was what he did. But this wasn't a logistics issue or a financial report. It wasn't something that could be fixed with numbers. By morning he walked into his office with dark circles under his eyes. As his employees began their shifts, his mind was still stuck on what he had witnessed the night before. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. His secretary peeked in. "Eva Mitchell is here to see you." Lucas lifted his head. He hadn't expected her. But he wasn't surprised either. "Let her in." Eva stepped inside, looking even more exhausted than the night before. But there was something else, hesitation. She sat down across from him, clasping her hands in her lap. "You asked for me, sir?" For a few seconds Lucas didn't know how to begin. Finally he chose the most direct approach. "I saw you last night." Eva's eyes widened. She froze for a moment. "I'm sorry." "What?" "I followed you." The room instantly grew heavy with silence. Shock crossed Eva's face, quickly replaced by a guarded expression. Her gaze sharpened, studying him like she was trying to figure out what this meant. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Lucas leaned slightly forward, meeting her gaze head-on. "Because I needed to see you." Eva tilted her head, took a slow breath but didn't look away. Lucas continued. "I saw why you asked for that food. I saw your children." Eva's shoulders tensed. Her fingers clenched tightly together. For a brief moment, she looked like someone whose pride had just taken a hit. "I'm not asking for charity." There was steel in her voice, a fighter's resolve, built over years of struggle. Lucas slowly shook his head. "This isn't charity." He pulled open a drawer and took out a thick envelope, placing it on the desk in front of her. "It's an investment." Eva glanced down at the envelope but didn't touch it. There was hesitation in her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why now?" Lucas took a moment before responding. His voice was quieter this time. "Because while building this company I overlooked some things. And it's time I start fixing that." Eva narrowed her eyes slightly as she opened the envelope. Inside there wasn't just money. There was a revised salary contract, a new child care support initiative for employees, and the first steps toward an emergency relief fund. This wasn't just a gesture, it was something that could change her life. Eva pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening for the briefest second before she quickly regained control. She had fought alone for so long that trusting someone's kindness didn't come easily. Lucas leaned slightly over the desk. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." Eva blinked at him, searching for words she couldn't seem to find. In the end she gave a small nod. Holding the envelope to her chest, she took a deep breath. As Lucas watched her walk out of his office, he felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. It was peace. This was only the beginning. And for the first time he wasn't just a businessman. He was a leader who truly stood for his people.